Again, my name is Keith Engel from Site. Here we are. I was enlisted, but I'm mainly a tax person. What we're talking about is managing market risk now, and how can you best manage the current environment. Now, it's interesting from a current market and a currency volatility. So how market and currency volatility match is a bit of a mystery for me. When I think marketing, I think of more of market and sales, but maybe I'm missing it and I'm not an accountant. So anyway, the moderator here is Rick Van Nykirk. He's the editor of MoneyWeb, always a very good magazine. Where is that? Is that you? And I always like dealing with Inge Engelbreit. So.
You would just have to announce that he's ill.
Oh.
And that I will be standing in.
Okay, Rick got ill. Okay, so Andre Silliers from Treasury One is coming on up. And now he's got to come up again. He seems very fit, so he goes up and down, and that's good stuff. But my goal is to get out of the way. Let's bring in the Army, and let's get the discussion rolling. Okay, there you go, Andre.
Thank you. Well, firstly, welcome to the panel. Everybody on the panel. I think we are chosen to discuss one of the most vibrant topics that faces every company on a daily basis. And I think if we look at market risk, and as an opening, I can simply say that just yesterday morning, I think we were faced with what market risk means. We all went to bed on Monday night, and it was all relatively calm, and we all knew exactly what's going to happen. We knew who's going to be the president of America, and we were all very relaxed about it. And all the exit polls told us exactly what's going to happen, exactly the same way that they did during the Brexit vote. Only to wake up 24 hours later, I'm saying Monday, that was Tuesday, only to wake up later and find that we've got a completely different guy that we expected to go to the White House, to be in the White House. And markets reacted swiftly and very aggressively. And it doesn't really matter in which company you operate and what you operate in. You were influenced by that, and you will be influenced by that going forward. So, having said that, I don't really want to spend too much time. We've got a whole panel of expertise here to discuss market risk. And I sort of want to start off by starting on that end of the panel and say, Dominic, what in your mind would be one of the most important things that we need to look at as a company when we talk about market risk? The most single thing that you would think. What would that be?
Right. Good morning. This question implies different answers. Sorry, it depends on the typology of the company. For a national company with no trade overseas, the question of the foreign exchange risk is quite minimum. For a company which is highly indebted, who has a lot of positive cash, or in short-term investment, the question of the interest rates is a concern. For others in the food or agribusiness, commodities is also a question that probably commodities plus foreign exchange risk. So that's totally different depending on one company or another. And then when it comes to the balance sheet and the profit and loss account, whether the company has a certain strategy of hedging, whether their own competitors have foreign exchange hedging as well, that's also a topic. Just not to keep to have a speech too long, let's take the example of an airline. Air France in the past used to hedge its own kerosene and oil exposure and foreign exchange exposure. The low-cost companies in Europe did not have access to this market because their credibility was not big enough for a long-term 2-year, 3-year strategy. And when the oil price has lowered dramatically, as we all know, the low-cost companies have costs which were far lower than the major ones which have been hedged. So that depends on each one's business.
Yeah, but think if I go one step back and then I'll ask Vikash to come in. I think I'm more referring to the steps that we would follow in the managing of market risk. So before we even look at hedging, before we even look at whether the dollar rand or the rupee or the peso or whatever, before we even look at the movement of an interest rate or an exchange rate, what would be the first step that you need to take in managing your risk?
Managing the market risk, first you need to have a good understanding of the different KPIs which has an impact on the market risk. So understand there are 10 different KPIs which can impact any risk. It can be your global sentiments, it can be your domestic sentiment, it can be your current account deficit, balance of payment, balance of trade, imports cover, seasonality and momentum. So if we understand these 8 and 10 different KPIs, I think we can develop a good risk matrix to understand possible volatility which can happen on the market. And the market here, I am also including the currency part, the FX part. So once we have that and we have a good understanding of the risk matrix, I think we will be able to understand the volatility in the market risk quite well. Important to have understanding of the country structure. How stable is the political environment in the country? Because any uncertainty, you will see that the market is behaving quite differently. And yesterday's example of Donald Trump is clear example. Like with the news, the Mexican peso has devalued significantly. Now there is a discussion on USD debt ratings. It can be downgraded. So while it has not happened, but there are still discussions. If that happens, you will see a significant impact on the exchange rates. So important to have a good understanding of the KPIs and develop a risk matrix. If we have that, I think we will be in a better position to control that.
I think that's the one where I wanted to get at, is in clear and simple terms. You have to identify exactly where your risk lies. And once you've known that, once you know that, then only can you really start in managing the risk. Otherwise, you're managing something that you're actually not quite sure of what the impact would be. I think there's a second step that comes in when one speaks about managing risks, is once you've identified what the risks are, George, and I will put this to you,
Sure.
Is if I know what my risk is, then I would have to go out into the market and establish some information as to what can be done about that risk. What would you recommend to the audience how to go about that in identifying what products is available and how they can manage that?
Thank you for asking that question. First of all, once you've been able to identify the risks that you need to address or hedge, then you can come up with the different solutions. Obviously, for economies that are working in different environments, the solutions would be very different. For example, we all know that the political factors have somewhat already become a part of the market factors, as we have seen during the results of the presidential elections in the United States. Right after the winning of President Trump, the markets reacted adversely but have somewhat corrected. So if you're in that type of a situation wherein your exposure needs to be corrected, let's say because of possible changes in policies, then it would be best that you be able to have some kind of a dialogue with the respective government agencies, the legislature, so that you can give your inputs to that. And we have been able to do that in many of our cases, because we in the Philippines also have a change in administration recently within the year, and we are now looking at tax reform packages, changes in certain pricing formulas. So that's what we're looking at right now. We've been able to give in our position papers. We've been able to have we've been summoned to both the Senate and Congress to give in our positions. And for the standard things like currency fluctuations and things like that, then many solutions are available, such as having some foreign exchange hedges, which obviously you end up paying for anyway. And at the same time, trying to take a look at your markets to see what would be the best way to structure whether it's going to be in the form of a letter of credit or it's going to be in the form of a direct payment, which could sometimes mitigate the exposure that you might have for both currency and interest rate risks.
Mnenzi, I have a question. I've now I've identified my risk. I've gone through the markets a little bit and I've looked at what products is available and what I can do. And I'm still not sure that I can manage my risk, because I would be a bit of a loose cannon if I were to do that, because I would have no approvals, no nothing. What would you think as a third one in managing this or mitigating risk? I wouldn't like to speak about managing risk. I'd like to speak about mitigating risk. Where does policies and procedures comes into place?
Okay, thank you for that question. But maybe before we even get to that, I just thought of something that I think we need to backtrack a bit when it comes to identifying the risks, because honestly, you're not gonna mitigate all the risks. Some you will have to tolerate depending on your risk appetite. I want to give an example. I think in this country, there was a year where the former president, Mandela, got sick. And just immediately the market reacted. Now the question I have is that, what are you going to do with it? When the head of state got sick, really how much are you going to assist the markets? Because the most important thing at the end of the day is to allay the uncertainty that the markets may actually perceive as a result of what is going to happen with this person. Will the policy still be implemented by those that now takes over? And I think that is one of the things that the investors want to be sure about. And as well as the economic policies that you talk about, the monetary policies that you talk about, do you implement them? And I think that's where our problems mostly, in general, actually emanates. But again, I think another emphasis should be on industrialization. Are we forming proper partnerships with our own industries? Because at the end of the day, over-dependency as well on imports is another problem. We cannot always keep on allowing and accepting the deficit, the trade deficit, year in, year out, and every month. And all we are going to focus on, it is just then how do we wait? Because whatever happens in the US, even if you have got nothing, you had nothing to do with it, then it affects the currency. So I think industrialization and forming proper partnerships and also making our own products competitive, I think it will be something that we can look at. And also ensuring that we educate customers here at home.
Yeah, I think that's very important, but I think it's also the one that I sort of wanted to get is, I think it's really important that once you know what your risk is, once you know what products can be used, is that there's actually got to be a policy that gets put into place within each company that says what is allowed, and it gets back to that risk matrix that Vikash was speaking about. If you look at the risk matrix, what is acceptable to my company? What is the parameters in which I can move? And that policy must be signed off. It's a policy to be signed off by the board, of the board of directors of the company, and implemented then by the CFO and through his structures in the company. I think then comes a very, very further really important part, and I'm going to go right back to Dominique again and say, what part does systems and technology play in this whole part in managing or stroke mitigating risk? What would be your opinion on that?
Systems are always after a board's decision in that matter. And that is something which is really mandatory and which is not broadly shared by each board. The question is, the initial question is, from the board's point of view, is how can I optimize my level of revenues and cost? And on the other hand, how can I optimize the use of my of my shares, of my capital? And this being fixed by the board, then all the policy can be declined accordingly. And then once it's done, you implement it in your own systems. And when it comes precisely to the system, they have to be flexible. It's very unlikely that you will find a system which is totally consistent with an IT and accounting system. One problem with the foreign exchange exposure is the fact that it applies nearly each day of the year, when for an accounting system you have it every closing, or at least every month. And this reconciliation is not that easy. So some solutions may apply, which helps the reconciliation between the two systems and the two reporting. This is mandatory. This is also mandatory that all the system you use can accommodate the tools and the financial instrument that you are using. Also can create some reporting about the volatility of your balance sheet or the volatility of your P&L. This is also absolutely key.
Yeah. Thank you. I think if I now take a step back and I say to the audience, you can see the approach that I'm trying to take here when we speak about managing market risk is not to look at where the currency are going in which I'm operating. It's not to look at where interest rates are going. It's not to look at which political party is going to win an election or anything. The emphasis that I'm trying to place here is that it's a process that starts actually long back, and with a lot of other work to be put into place before you actually look at whether the currency is moving up or down, or whether the interest rates are moving up and down. So it's a very systematic approach, and it's an approach where you as the CFO needs information on your desk. You need to walk in the morning, switch on your laptop, be it in the office, be it at home, be it on your beach chair. You want to switch on your computer, you want to open a dashboard that sits up in front of you, and you want information as to what is my bank balances, what is my foreign exchange risk, what is hedged on that, at what rate is it hedged, what is open, and most probably with a bit of a what-if scenario, if the rate moves to this end or to that end, what would be the impact on my income statement and my balance sheet? So not a system, not a question of a discussion loosely around at a cocktail party as to where rates are going, but actually knowing what would happen to my company if something goes out of this way or that way, and actually knowing what my risk is. And in the case of a liquidity crunch, what is the facilities that I have available? At what rates would they be available? What would be the tenor that the availability would be? Too many times I think we sit with a situation where, I've got a project running and I've got a call facility, but that doesn't necessarily tie up with the lifetime of my project. It doesn't necessarily tie up with a payback on it or anything. And then suddenly, somewhere in between, a crisis occurs. The bank calls me and says your facility is reduced, and suddenly I sit with a liquidity crunch. If I had put these things in place and I had managed that through systems, I would better know what it is. George, in what I've just said, would you concur that it's more of a systematic approach rather than analyzing a market?
Well, actually, there are a lot of models that CFOs can create wherein you plug in certain variables such as the exchange rate, the interest rates, and so on, from which, depending on what the simulations that you would be able to create, you could actually determine how profitable the company would be. You could generate your cash flows and things like that. And I think those are the tools that have become more relevant over recent times, because you really cannot sometimes predict the movement of many of these things, but because of the ability to plug in certain variables and come up with the pro forma financial statements based on certain inputs that you have, then you can have a snapshot of, if the exchange rate devalues to this much, the interest rates move up to this much, or any other variable that you would decide, for example, market share and so on. And based on that, you can do some advanced planning on what to do to maybe address the situation. So if you can see that you're going to fall short on cash because of this event or this simulation, then you can start working on your credit facilities with the banks. If you know, for example, the exchange rates will lead to a certain deterioration of profits, then you could probably try to find ways to become more efficient that will somewhat mitigate that situation. So I totally agree that all of these technological tools are very important, and a lot of CFOs have started to use them already.
Yeah. Nancy, you, on the side that you are, if I can sort of put it to you, do you think there's any value in trying to predict markets and the outcome of markets and following from that prediction, project that into your business?
Yeah, I believe there is, and I think there is a lot of value in doing that. But I think the accuracy may not necessarily be automatic. But again, risk management does not necessarily mean identifying the risk and managing it are two different things. So I think the availability of data at the end of the day, without the proper assessment, there's going to be a problem. Now, I'm trying to emphasize the importance of retaining the right skills to interpret whatever can come from that data. I wanted to emphasize on the issue of systems. Yes, systems as well, they are what makes an organization. But who is going to look at that information when it comes out? The retention strategies, I think that's what CFOs need to also assist the organizations when they go there. Retain the right skills to be able to interpret that data. Then you can be able to implement. Because you can measure the risk, but measuring it and managing it are two different things.
I would agree with that 100%, and I think there should be a big Chinese wall between managing the risk and execution of those policies. Because I'd like to bring you in a little bit here. You, and we've briefly spoke beforehand, operate in 70 countries. That must be at times very challenging, knowing what your exposures are in all these 70 countries. Can you give us some ideas in managing over a 70-country span the importance of centralizing some of these functions?
Sure. So I'll just give you a brief about how do we manage different type of risk. And just for the benefit of everybody, we can classify all type of risk. Irrespective of the industry, irrespective of the companies, all the risk can be categorized into three categories. The first one is the market risk. The market risk will largely include your price risk, price of the product. It is a differential and basis risk if it is an exchange traded product, and your currency risk. And currency risk we can talk later. It includes both for the working capital as well as fixed capital. While a lot of solutions that we discuss is for the working capital, but I think the fixed capital is also one of the risk area where we can discuss. So that's the first category. The second category of risk that we see is the credit and counterparty. If there is a huge volatility in the market, and even if you have signed a contract, the counterparty most likely is going to default. So then you will convert that closed position into an open position on the market risk side. And the third can be the operational risk. It can be inventory risk, it can be factory yield risk, it can be quality risk, various other types of risk, which you are in a better position to manage. Now, the way we try to manage, considering the various geographies and the various BUs, we do a risk budgeting at the beginning of the year, where we try to allocate risk capital. So suppose you have an equity net worth of say $100. Now as a board, as a company, what is the maximum erosion in the value as a company we are willing to take. So suppose now it's 5%. So my risk capital will become 5. And that risk capital will consist of all the market risk, credit, counterparty, and operating risk. Then that risk capital we allocate across the various BUs that we have. So out of say 5 BUs will get 1, 1.5. So we allocate the risk capital and to the various BUs. And then from the BUs, say I take an example of a BU, say coffee. Coffee is present in 20 out of 70 countries. So from the global level, first the risk capital is allocated to coffee as a BU. And then from the coffee as a BU, then they allocate the risk capital further to the different geographies.
But I think what I'm trying to get at is, in terms of managing foreign exchange
yes.
risk
So I was
and
coming
interest
to
rate
that.
risk,
Yeah.
in
That is-
centralizing
Yeah,
that
so
as a
first we
function.
define what is the risk appetite that we want to take. So the risk limit is critical for you, right? So that is first. The second, definitely the system will play a critical role. I think without system risk will become a bigger risk than the market risk. So you need to have a good system to track your open positions. Whether you are long in something or you're short on something, you need to have a good tool to track your positions on the price side, on your credit side, on your currency side. So once you are able to track through a centralized system for the different profit centers, and then you can consolidate it for the BU and then for the company, I think then that way it can work quite well.
Your opinion on that, Dominic, on centralization of treasury functions?
Yes. In many multinational companies with different business units and different business as such, there is a dual organization with a full centralization at the head office level for the whole group. But at the same time, within the businesses, there are centralization within the business of all the market risks. And if these businesses, which are fully responsible for their own P&L and their own balance sheet exposure, just on the very business they are working on, they can hedge themselves via a virtual hedging contract, or virtual hedging position, or virtual hedging of debt or short-term investment vis-à-vis the head office. And this central treasury at the head office may manage and does manage the global exposure, the global consolidated exposure. So that's a two-tier type of centralization, I would say.
I'm going to get back to the audience because we need to sort of try and get some of our time back that we've lost earlier during the day. I think what you can see clearly is what I'm trying to do here is to absolutely steer away from discussing what happens in markets. Because I think what happens in markets on a daily basis has actually got nothing to do with managing risk or mitigating foreign exchange or interest rate or liquidity or operational risk at all in your organization. I know that there's a lot of people out there that's got all sorts of models that predict where the exchange rates and where the interest rates are going to go. I know that there's a lot of people out there that becomes very clever and tells you that they know where it's going to go. I can tell you that I've been in the markets for many, many years. You can just look at the little bit of hair that I have. And then I can tell you that if I knew where the exchange rate is going to go of any currency, there is not a snowball's chance in hell that I would have been sitting on this white chair today to discuss this. I would have owned my own island or several of them, and I would have most probably been able to buy most of the companies out that sits and is represented here today. So nobody really knows that. No models can predict that. And as CFOs, as treasurers, as financial managers, we should move away from trying to manage risk on a day-to-day basis by looking at where the markets are going or try and predict where they are going. There should be policies in place. There should be risk matrices in place. There should be product approvals in place, because there's no point, once again, you can do the most fancy option structure to manage risk or deemed managed risk, only to find out 6 months later or 2 months later that your accounting is an absolute nightmare, that you cannot account for it, and that it actually doubled up on your risk, and that the bank was only too willing to sell that to you because they made a lot of money out of it. Make sure that your systems can manage it. I would much rather prefer at this point in time, in the last 5 or 7 minutes, to throw out to the panel, to the audience, if they have any questions for the panel up here. Any questions?
How would trend analysis and big data, and that's mainly for cash, how would that influence your risk management going forward? So it's more the operational risk side.
So trend analysis is very critical for us. When we calculate the value at risk for the different BUs, for the different component, all the 5 components that I talked about, for each component we calculate the value at risk. And for value at risk calculation, we need the trend analysis to understand the volatility factor. And there is a different formula for value at risk, where we take the price of the commodity into the volatility factor. For calculation of the volatility factor, the trend analysis is important. And there are different statistical methods which is used by different companies. So what we do is that we take a time series of the last 100 days data. And accordingly, then we calculate the volatility factor. For a product, what is the maximum volatility that we have seen in the last 100 days? And that factor we use to calculate the value at risk.
Any more questions? I'm sure that there must be 1 or 2 questions coming from the audience. Okay, then I would like to conclude, then we're a little bit on track, by saying, emphasize once again, know what your risk is. Know what your policies is as to what is acceptable. Make sure that you have systems that can manage that risk, that can point it out to you, that can give you financial reporting, rather than trying to speculate on markets and trying to determine where markets is going to go and then manage it afterwards. Because if you do that, then the markets are actually managing your policies and your risk framework. And your risk framework and your policies is not managing the market. And I think there's a big, big change that needs to take place throughout the world in that, is that your systems, policies, manages market risk, not the other way around. If you manage it the other way around, I'm sorry to say, but you're speculating. And I always say to a lot of people, if you're going to speculate, go down the road to a casino, put your money on black or red. They serve free drinks at the casino. It's far more pleasurable sitting in your office trying to predict who's going to be the president, who's going to fire the Minister of Finance, whether we're in the European, outside the European Union. We do not know these things. We'll never know it. And we cannot allow other people to manage our businesses without having the systems and the policies to retaliate and get rid of that risk. Dominic, conclusion from you.
Yes, well, two words. The first one is running a casino may be something very honorable. One who runs a casino may become head of state, which we knew from yesterday. That's one thing. And the second thing is, when it comes to managing or mitigating the risks, it's also a question of reduction or a question of transfer. And you have to know what the level of the risk is. So there is a question of assessment, but also of transfer. I'll give you few examples. We all know about the off-balance sheet product, about futures, about options, whatever. And some people are very greedy with the option strategy and the zero price option strategy. Know that, like Google, if you are sold or given quote-unquote, an option strategy, this means you are the product, and the bank will make a lot of profit out of this strategy. That's one thing. But what is less known is about the transfer, is the fact that your clients may be your counterparties for this transfer of risk. Let's say, for example, that for an exchange risk, that you are to sell products overseas. If you can bill in your own currency the goods which is delivered, you will have transferred this foreign risk, which is also important. Some people used to bill in someone else's currency, but the amount of the bill is modified according to the level of the foreign exchange itself. So that's also one part. And the final part that I would like to address on this, precisely in this country or on this continent, it's question of outsourcing or delocalization. When one of the best foreign exchange management or reduction is to build your goods or to create your goods in the country where you sell them. So let's take Airbus has created a plant in Florida, not only to sell planes to the U.S. Army, which has been the initial reason, but it's moreover because all the planes in the aircraft industry are sold in U.S. dollar, and therefore you build everything in U.S. dollar, you sell in U.S. dollar, even if you build with the cost in euro, I mean you sell in U.S. dollar, so your foreign exchange risk is only on the profit and only on the dividend. So that's also something that needs to be taken into account. So outsourcing and delocalization are not only for reaching low labor costs, but also having a push of your exchange risk and also your interest rate risk if you are in a country with a very low interest rate risk.
I have to stop you there. I'd like to give George a 35-second closing remark.
Well, I think this has been a very fruitful discussion, but what I would like to share is the success or failure of many companies that I'm familiar with has been with respect to how they manage the risk that they face and how quickly they're able to react to it. And in a lot of cases, companies that have seen the writing on the wall have not been able to adapt properly to address these risks and have ended up being left behind by new technologies or new policies that let their businesses become passé.
Yeah. Because?
So I will say
29-second discussion from you. Closing remark.
So I think the first one is to understand various type of risk in your business. I think we should take a pen and list down all possible sort of risk that is there in the business. After understanding the risk, the second is to fix the value at risk. The risk capital that we want to allocate for a particular business unit or profit center or at the global level. Once we have fixed the value at risk, have the limits in place. What is the open exposure that you are willing to take for the commodity price, for the currency, for credit, for counterparty? So fix the limits, have the systems and processes to track and monitor that. And fifth, the risk response. If some risk materialize, how we are going to respond to that particular scenario. So that your risk response summary also should be prepared well in advance so that you are not caught unaware.
You may have 3 seconds more than the rest because you've got a word called parliament next to you. So we can't really limit your time, but I have to today.
Thank you very
But I'll
much.
give you 3 seconds more.
Thank you very much. I think for me, the emphasis is on speculating the market has become more complex than at least even speculating the weather. At least when they say it's going to rain, it's going to rain. Meaning, we may want to stay away from speculating. But I think the emphasis as well is on the corporate strategies must never and should never undermine the risk framework of an organization. So the attitude of management must be able to be exemplary in terms of managing the risk. And those should be the values that everybody should live. Thank you.
I think then I will conclude there. I will make one more remark, and that's just in the calculation of risk. If you import 5 and you export 5, then 5 minus 5 is 0. I know that there's some people that says 5 plus 5 is 10. Now, I'm always wondering, why would I want to manage 10 if I can actually manage 0? But that's a debate open for discussion. Once again, not something generic for your company or for all companies. It depends on your company. But I think that's why I've emphasized there's certain steps, and I think Prakash and everybody on the panel agrees that there's certain steps in managing risk, and that's not discussing where markets are going. Thank you very much.
Thank you.